So I've just finished watching a bunch of trailers from the recent Sony gaming conference where they unveiled a lot of new material surrounding the Final Fantasy VII Remake, and I was not planning on making any more videos surrounding this topic, but I just can't help myself here. And it was quite funny because the last video I made about the remake turned out to be my most popular video, and perhaps not for the right reasons. I mean, a third of the ratings on the video are dislikes, and every other day I get a salty comment from some butthurt new Square Enix fan who loves all of this compilation content, absolutely loves Kingdom Hearts, and is extremely offended by my negative take on this Final Fantasy VII Remake. But you know what, I really don't care. I am a lifelong Final Fantasy VII fan, specifically. In my last video I mentioned it, it's probably my favorite game of all time, the original. And just watching the collection of trailers that came out of this recent Sony conference, it really just cements my overall disdain for Square Enix. I have not been a fan of this company for a long time. I'd say coming close to about 20 years at this point. I feel like the moment Square, as in the legendary company Squaresoft, merged with Enix, it has been a shadow of its former glory, and every project that Square Enix releases has this element of cynicism about it, which is just so transparent. It's obvious that this company is fixated with the bottom line. Their main concern is making money, and they've really lost that sense of passion that you could just tell. I mean, it was synonymous with the Squaresoft name. The fact that they went the extra mile, they spent extra time in development, polishing, and releasing the best possible games that they could, which is distinctly different from every game simply ending up in development hell, which is something that Square Enix have become infamous for. But from the release of the original Final Fantasy in 1987 up until around 2003 with the release of Final Fantasy X, Squaresoft had a hard-earned reputation for quality. And after 10 was released, this is the period that the merger took place with Enix, which was mandated by the higher-ups due to a huge loss sustained after the failure of the Final Fantasy Spirits Within motion picture fiasco, which I'd like to do a separate video on someday, but I knew it from the moment that they even considered doing a direct sequel to one of their successful games. There's an element of cynicism to it, and I played Final Fantasy X-2 at release, and it was the first FF game that I really just went, wow, this is kind of lazy. This is a rehash of Final Fantasy X using a bunch of assets from the original game, and it's being churned out because, yeah, I mean, why not? It was an opportunity for the newly formed Square Enix to make a little cash, and the game itself, it didn't even take itself seriously. It kind of cheapened the lore and the ending of Final Fantasy X, which was still, I consider 10 to be a PS2 era masterpiece. Say what you want about the changes to the actual gameplay, the removal of the overworld, it's still a Final Fantasy game because it still has the element of polish, of quality, creativity, and I love Final Fantasy X. In comparison, I mean, X-2 is kind of a meme, and I know a lot of people like it now. I mean, it has this kind of element of nostalgia and weirdness and quirkiness to it, but is it an absolutely necessary entry in the overall mythos of the Final Fantasy series? The answer is no, and that is the beginning of the Square Enix era, and that element of cynicism introduced with X-2 has been there since the release of that game. I think that perhaps 12, you could argue, had some real creativity behind it. Obviously, it was designed and directed by Matsuno, the guy behind the FF Tactics spin-off series, which I also really enjoy. He was also behind Vagrant Story, another classic for the PS1. But aside from 12, which really could have been named, Final Fantasy Tactics 2 or something like that, the series has had this exploitative edge to it, and I think it's kind of difficult to describe, but let me put it this way. It feels like where the Final Fantasy series was this kind of earnest attempt at pushing video games into something closer to, classic novel or a piece of art, right? I don't want to get too pretentious with this, but you play Final Fantasy IX and it's like this fairy tale, just incredible experience. It's timeless. And you compare it to modern Square Enix, there's this element of the Akihabara High Street, weeb pandering, otaku pandering edge to it, where I get a sense that there's this gacha mentality worming its way, this fan service, anime, horny teenager kind of vibe, worming its way into the Final Fantasy series. And what is that all about? Well, the company, they know, the people in charge now, they understand that Final Fantasy has this big fan base, and a lot of them are lowest common denominator Coomers, for lack of a better term, and that's the new target audience for Final Fantasy, and it has been for a long time. Just your generic broad anime fan, both in Japan and overseas, which is where the weeb thing comes in. But if you look at it from that point of view, it makes a lot more sense, and it's a financially driven decision by the company. A company whose decisions are not being made by someone with a vision, right? That's what Sakaguchi was all about. He had a vision for the series, and he, better than anyone else, and I'm talking about, Katase, Nomura, all these other names that you hear, that they wheel them out and they say, oh, the Final Fantasy VII Remake is being directed by Tetsuya Nomura and it's written by Katase, right? Like, you're not allowed to criticize the garbage fanfic tier writing because, look at who wrote it. Don't you know Nomura is a genius? How dare you criticize Nomura? It's like, I dare because this sucks. The new Final Fantasy compilation of FF and all the other shit surrounding this, it sucks, okay? All you have to do is have just a tiny modicum of taste to understand that, no, this is 10,000 times worse than a game that came out in 1997, regardless of the fact that these hacks are still involved with the production of this remake. It's irrelevant because, you know what? You're forgetting Sakaguchi, perhaps willfully ignoring the huge influence and contribution that this man made. He is the father of Final Fantasy. He was there since the beginning, and he gave the series and the company actual direction, right? Like, whereas now, no, it's about pandering to the Coomer wank fantasies of the modern Final Fantasy fanbase, and that is what drives the direction of this series now. And you only have to watch the recent trailers and the content coming out of this recent Sony conference. It's clear as day how fucking disgusting Square Enix have treated such a legendary series that's so important to the history of video games. They treat it like a cash cow at every opportunity they get to try and milk this classic IP for every penny that they can. And you only have to look at the compilation of Final Fantasy VII, Tetsuya Nomura's fucking brainchild, his master magnum opus, to realize that this is literally just a fat otaku masturbating into a body pillow of Aerith while, Gact plays in the background. Like, that is what this series has become. It's like if they turned the Sistine Chapel into a whorehouse. That's the way I feel that Square Enix have treated Final Fantasy over the years. I mean, and look at this new trailer. They're advertising that, okay, we're adding a Yuffie DLC extra chapter to the Final Fantasy VII Remake story, confirming that this is indeed some kind of compilation of Final Fantasy sequel alternate timeline entry. It is not a remake at all. It's not being faithful to the plot of FF7 from 1997. I've already ranted about this in my previous video, and I don't want to touch on it again too much, but this is the attitude of Square Enix. It's like, yeah, we know what you want, and we're just not going to do that. We're aware that the Final Fantasy compilation titles haven't done very well overall. A lot of them are very low quality, poorly received. We're going to produce more content in that vein. We're going to trick you into thinking that we're going to do an actual one-to-one remake with better graphics and better gameplay, and then we're going to go, you know what? Yuffie in Midgar, during the original plot where she's not even supposed to be part of the story yet, she's dressed as a Moogle and is weebing around, giggling, and interacting with characters from Dirge of Cerberus, the Nomura spin-offs, and like, oh my god, the level of cringe is just, it's too much for me to comprehend. And just to save you some time, so I don't have to respond individually, the guy typing in, oh yeah, well, you're just a dinosaur and you don't get it. You can go fuck yourself, okay? Because you don't understand the appeal of Final Fantasy at all. You just want to jerk off to Yuffie's new design with her unbuttoned shorts, like, oh, thank you, Nomura-san, for keeping the unbuttoned shorts when you did reduce the booba of Tifa and you gave her that weird sports bra, like, so that Snoy would be happy. fuck you. And like Final Fantasy VII Remake at this point, it might as well just be a waifu simulator, because that really is all it has going for it. It's insulting to any fan of the old school series. It's actually insulting. It's turned Final Fantasy VII, one of the greatest, if not the greatest, JRPG of all time, into a waifu softcore masturbation fantasy. That is all. And you know what? I have no problem with waifu masturbation fantasies, just to clarify. But do you have to make my favorite game of all time? Something that actually it had an aspirational, transcendent quality to it, where it was not just another cash grab, it wasn't just another PS1 game, it really was a cultural milestone in the history of this industry. Now, let's turn it into just, yes, it's an otaku sitting there in his apartment just jerking it. That is what Final Fantasy VII now has been reduced to. It's becoming similar to Star Wars in that this is just an absolute desecration of a series that people once held in such high regard. And I can't stand seeing it exploited to this degree. It's like, Jesus, take this horse out behind the barn and put a bullet in his head. Not because you hate the horse, you love the horse. Put it out of its misery, okay? But they won't do it because they need to squeeze every last penny, every last yen out of this series. And the cherry on the cake is this new episodic mobile game that they're releasing called Final Fantasy VII Ever Crisis, okay? Now, what is Ever Crisis? It is a quote-unquote nostalgic reimagining of the remake of Final Fantasy VII. It is, in essence, the remake that perhaps people maybe wanted, but it's not. You know, it's another Square Enix absolute gaslight mindfuck, right? It is, in essence, just one big middle finger to FF fans like yours truly, right? Where, on first glance, you go, wow, this looks kind of like the original Final Fantasy VII, but with slightly higher pre-render quality and better chibi character models. And then when you look at the actual gameplay, wow, it's like the same quality as the remake. Well, don't celebrate just yet, okay? Because you know what it really is? It's an episodic mobile game with gacha elements to it, and they're going to cover not just the original plot of FF7 in this new, irritating style, which is lazy. The character portraits look terrible, by the way. No, Ever Crisis is actually a retelling of the entire saga of FF7. We're talking every single piece of the Nomorian compilation. All of the extra crap, that bloated lore that does nothing but cheapen the overall story of FF7, that's all canon now. Ever Crisis and the remake itself cements the Nomorian autism of the compilation of Final Fantasy VII as 100% canon. As if Sakaguchi hasn't been shafted enough over the years, he's a distant memory, and a lot of these weebs that give me shit in the comments section probably never even heard of Hironobu Sakaguchi, but this is really the final nail in the coffin, because Nomura now is sitting on his throne while his irritating, just like 13-year-old fucking Kingdom Hearts fans are cheering that yes, we've claimed Final Fantasy VII as our own. It's ours now, and Nomura deserves all the credit. Old school fans, you can go fuck yourselves. No one cares about what you wanted anymore. Even though you were the ones initially calling for the remake, like 20 years ago. Nope, you get Nomura's vision. That's what you get. And he's going to take credit for the original Final Fantasy VII, whether he deserves it or not. So get ready, because they're going to have to relicense Gat's image so we can get the Crisis Core, the Genesis, and the emo, yeah, like Angeal. Genesis. Gact. You know, like, that is what's coming, and that's all you're ever gonna get when you hear the name Final Fantasy VII. It's just gacha, anime, weeb bullshit from now until forever. And if you don't like it, well, you're gonna have to take it up with Goofy or Donald, because no one working at the Square Enix Corporation gives a single solitary fuck about maintaining the integrity or the legacy of the Final Fantasy series.